should take the tractor up, he said, well, we couldn't possibly do that because that would mean the tractor, well, it would take 2 days for a start, and the tractor would have to work for 8 hours each day, and that, we can't do that with our tractor. So of course I said, look, that's what tractors do. They plough for 8 hours of a day, and then they plough for 8 hours the next day. So I'll do it. So I fitted out this tractor with front mud guards and a loud horn, and attached the Olympia trailer and set off. And indeed, in 2 days' time, I did arrive up on the long road, just as it was getting dark. So 55, 56, I get my silver C. The pattern in those days was you went solo in your first year of the 3 years in Cambridge. You got your silver C in the second year, and you instructed in the third year. So there was a complete cycle of the third year people teaching the first year people to fly. Unfortunately, there was Ted, of course, doing much of the teaching and practically all the teaching during weekday flying, which undergraduates mostly did. But there were also people like Bryce, who took me up on one of my first flights, Andrew Hume's father, John Hume, people like that who mostly were flying at the weekends. But for the undergraduate flying, it was great if you could be an undergraduate club instructor in your third year. So I did about 170 Bluebell instructional flights without causing any, well, not without causing much damage, actually. Well, I left-handed, and somebody had the bright idea that I should fly in the instructor's seat, the left-hand seat, left-handed, so that I could operate the spoilers with my right hand. I think Bluebell now has spoilers, has 2 sets of spoiler handles. Yes? No? I think so anyway. But the original T21s, they just had spoiler handle in between the 2 pilots. And what lanky people like me and Ted used to do is we would do it with our left hand under our right leg, hoping not to have to put on too much rudder at the time. That's how we could work it. But somebody had the idea that that wasn't a good thing to encourage, and that you should land with your left hand. And then you could operate the spoilers with your right hand. Well, that was all very well for right-handed people, but of course left-handed people notoriously can get confused between their left and their right hand, because we live in a right-handed world, and yet we're left-handed people. And so we often have to adapt to do things with our right hands, which we prefer to do with our left hand. And this leads to some sort of psychological confusion, which is quite well known. Remember that accident that took place to a Boeing 737 landing at the East Midlands Airport, landing on the M1 many, many years ago. That was an example of the left-hand, right-hand confusion. One engine wasn't working, and the pilot shut down the wrong engine at the wrong moment. However, that's what happens with powered aircraft. But with gliders, that can happen too, because there I was, flying Bluebell, down on the approach, flying with my left hand, spoilers, about to open the spoilers with my right hand, and I suddenly got confused as to which one I was supposed to pull to round out. So I did the sensible thing. I did nothing. Because if I'd opened the spoilers, that would have made it a very big bang. So I just didn't do anything, so there was a little bang. But it did break the keel, and Ted had to mend it. So yes, I did do some damage, I'm afraid. Prizes for anybody who can name the first pilot I took up as an instructor. Now obviously the only reason I'm asking that is because somebody might remember, might know him today, for example.
Steve Longland? Steve Longland?
Not bad, oh no, he was a youngster. I'm talking about the 1950s. No, it was Peter O'Donnell. Peter was a research student in the same department as me, and he wanted to start a ballooning club. And I said, well, there's an easy way to do that, because if you go to the proctors and say you want to start a ballooning club, they will become very thoughtful, you see. But if you join the gliding club, then you could create a ballooning section of the gliding club, and the proctors wouldn't notice. That was the way we were going to go with that. So he hasn't yet taken up ballooning. He's still doing gliding. Anyway, he was my first pupil. Right, now I've got some pictures to show you, so I don't want to spend too much time just chatting away here, but I did want to chat away for a bit to try and give you some idea of the sort of atmosphere of what we were up to. From 57, my brother and I and one other pilot flew Bluebell in the Nationals. But there's not much I can tell you about that really. We were at Nasham. We flew Bluebell. I mean, we did cross countries. We came bottom but one. We had a wonderful time. We had various problems, like when we took Bluebell down to Nasham, we forgot the struts. So, I'd been rowing for 2 years, so I had pretty good back muscles, which was just as well, because for the whole of that Nasham, Nasham Nationals, I was the one who was carrying Bluebell's wing route into the trailer, which was far into the trailer, every evening, and carrying it out every morning, both wings. So that was quite a memory. In 1958, some of us decided that we would go to a new expedition site. We would go up to Crossfell in the Lake District and attempt to imitate the great flights that had taken place just before the war, when the famous Helm wind at Crossfell had been flown in and flown, the wave had taken a prefect pilot up to 15,000 feet, something like that. And we thought, well, we can do that too. So, 4 of us, Peter Bullman, whom I saw yesterday, my friend John Griffiths, and Stuart Waller, whom I've already mentioned, we persuaded the committee to let us take the Skylark 2, and John Griffiths, being an engineer and very ambitious to go to great heights in the Crossfell wave, he loaded it up with oxygen, great big heavy cylinder, and then of course he needed artificial horizons, so he fitted an artificial horizon. Normally we were just flying on turn and slip in cloud in those days, and that seemed to require a huge lead acid accumulator. And then I think, I don't think we did have radio, but anyway, a Skylark is a fairly high wing-loaded machine anyway. By the time we put oxygen and a big accumulator in it, and John Griffiths in it too, because he's quite a big chap, it really is a very overloaded machine. But we managed to fly that quite happily around the Lake District. We had an east wind all the time, well, a sort of southeast wind, so the Helm wave never blew. But we auto-bungeed this Skylark off a hill called Priest's Crag over Ullswater for a week. And there were various incidents, but my time is running out for this bit, so we won't go into those, which is probably just as well. After that, the 3 of us decided that we wanted a glider of our own. Now, there were no private gliders in Cambridge. I can't say that ours was going to be the first private glider, because, of course, when the club started in 1935, all the gliders were private gliders. They nearly all belonged to Rafe Schlesinger. So we couldn't afford to buy a glider, but you could get a Slingsby Swallow kit from Slingsby's. So the 4 of us, the ones I mentioned, but also John Deems, because Peter Bullman was not involved in the building of the Swallow, and in the shed, which is still standing in my house in Bolton, we built a Swallow from a kit. it was a penguin. And that's what we did. People don't sort of do things like that anymore. Aeroplanes perhaps don't come in kit form. But it taught us an enormous amount, and we were very proud of this aeroplane, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment. So we spent most of 1959 building the glider, which eventually we called Penguin because it had such short wings. And in May we flew her for the first time. Actually, Ted Warner flew her the test flight May the 1st, 1960, and the paint on the ailerons was not yet dry. Of course, there was a great rush at the end to get it finished in time for the first flight. And what did we do with this glider? Well, of course, we took it up to the Clwyd, and we had a wonderful time flying it up the Clwyd. And in 1961, also in January, we had another camp up there, auto-bungee from Bill Peace's Chicken Run, but also from further up the hill where there was a bit more space. And then in 1961, in October, I went off to Italy, to the University of Padua, and didn't come back to Cambridge for another 7 years. So that really takes me to the end of what I wanted to talk about, because that was my experience of the period from 1955 to 1961. That's how we did things, that's how it was. Nothing stood in our way. We had an enormous amount of fun. I suspect we had more fun per buck than you get now. But it's a different sort of fun, of course. In a way, we were a bit irresponsible, but, nothing happened. No serious problems. We just had a whale of a time. And what goes on now sort of seems a bit staged to my generation, really. But I think now, what I'd like to do is just to whiz through these pictures, which illustrate what I've been saying. So I'm not going to stop for long on any of them. I'm just going to whiz through to finish up with at least some pictures of what's going on. The club's first glider, you've probably seen the picture which is up in by the bar. That's a Zugling going off at Dunstable in 1935. The club really was an offshoot of the London Gliding Club to begin with, because students used to go down to Dunstable to get their flying, and then some of them said, well, why can't we do it? Why can't we do it near Cambridge? There is in the archive this wonderful book of photographs, I think produced as publicity material by somebody in 1935, and this is what it contains. This is Caxton Gibbet. Now, next time you fly over Caxton Gibbet, I think you can see that bar. I've never actually thought of looking carefully when I've been in a glider, because it's the sort of thing you don't think about. So somebody must think, when flying, see if you can find that bar. Typical glider, I think that's the BAC 7 two-seater, but we'll have some better pictures. There it is, two-seater, and there's a very recognisable John Pringle, our first president, peering into the cockpit, and others doing useful things underneath. There it is again. It even flies, rather remarkably. Comes down again. Then has to be retrieved. Now that's a willow wren, which I think was another of Sassenger's purchases, flying through Caxton Gibbet. And there's the barn in the background, behind the wingtip man. The ponds. Along the ponds. A chap called, I think I've got a record of his name, Cecil Allen, in it. And that's at Caxton. I don't have time to tell you more about the ponds. It's a Cambridge one, familiarly known as the ponds, because it was the link between solo training and being allowed to fly in Olympia. There's not a crash. That's a camp at Hewish in 1938, and they're thinking about rigging by the looks of things. Haven't quite got around to it yet. This looks a bit of a dice, very slow, nose up. It's no wonder they're looking at whether he's going to get over the hedge or not. I don't know whether he did. I don't know what that is that's being rigged, but again it's the Hewish camp. There is the chief flying instructor. Naomi Heron Maxwell was a professional pilot, and she was hired to be the chief flying instructor of the club in 1938. Evidently quite a character. Caused the Proctors endless trouble because it hadn't occurred to them that ladies could be members of the gliding club, and it hadn't occurred to us that you could have a chief flying instructor who wasn't a member of the gliding club. So I think some sort of negotiation took place, and you can be sure that Pringle won in the end. But it did mean that many, many years later, when the Booker Club claimed in sailplane and gliding to have had the first woman chief flying instructor, I was able to write a nice letter to S&G correcting them, but we had one before the war. I'll not stop with that. There are trailers at Hewish. There is a winch that they built, being towed down to Hewish. This is a Longmynd camp, and I can identify everybody except one in this picture, but the names would be of no great interest to you, but I'm very happy to show them on print afterwards. Here's a collection of photographs that I got from Ted Warner. Sorry this one's a bit crooked, but I stuck them all on to take a scan of them at the same time. There's a very early picture of Bluebell. There's the Chronic. Well, I should be pointing on the screen, but you know what I mean. Here is the tutor being hand-launched at the Mynd. If it's windy, you actually don't need a bungee to launch a tutor. It's got some nice struts, so you just push it off the edge, and that's what they're doing. That's a sensible way to launch the plane. Here's a very nice picture of John Pringle, President, with the famous Anne Welch from Lasham, and they're looking at the Brunt Trophy, which Cambridge had just won. My brother, incidentally, was the first winner of the Brunt Trophy in 1948. It was a trophy for height between university gliding clubs, and I shudder to think what's happened to it. That picture I've shown you already, but now it's in sequence because I've got to 1949. We've now got to Marshall's. There's the new Olympia, and on the right is the ponds. More friends of ours from those days. Somebody asked what happened to the ponds. That's what happened to the ponds. No pieces were kept as souvenirs as far as I know. And by all accounts it was a very nice aeroplane. You flew it, Alan?
Yes.
Flew it.
Very nice.
I think that the best project